A little less than a year ago, I ran into Matthias in Brussels, and we know each other since 2 years because I was at a conference 2 years ago too. So when we crossed paths in Brussels, he signaled me, "Hey Tom, good news, the topic of the next TMAF conference will be something that will interest you, maneuver warfare." Now, at that time, I dismissed his enthusiasm, believing that maneuver warfare was primarily something for practitioners, which I'm not. So when I eventually received the invitation to this conference a few months later, I was still very hesitant. And I was wondering, as a professor of history, specialized in trench warfare in the First World War. It works. I wondered what I could possibly contribute to a discussion on the relevance of maneuver warfare in 2024. Now, at the very same time, I had been closely following the war in Ukraine, and what began as some vague professional interest quickly became a time-consuming hobby. As the conflict in Ukraine progressed and moved on, or rather the opposite, as the conflict in Ukraine got, air quote, stalemated, I started noticing more and more physical similarities between the black and white pictures of 1418, the First World War, and the recent images from Ukraine. So one of the first... Only the arrows work. One of the first striking similarities that I saw was drone footage from trench warfare and trench clearing in 22 already. That's just straight textbook and field manual of the grenadiers of the First World War specialized in clearing trenches. Now, there were many other similarities that I saw. Different sceneries, whether it's the completely shut up trees that stick out of the soil as some kind of a toothpick, and the upper picture is always Ukraine, the lower picture is the Western Front. The lunar landscapes with the artillery shells and impacts that create shelter holes filled with water or not. The trenches, obviously, above in the mud, below no mud, but believe me, in the trenches of the First World War there was quite a lot of mud too. The garbage you see in the bottom front of the First World War it's a German trench abandoned by the end of the war. You see a lot of garbage. That was what I often saw in pictures from Russian trenches in Ukraine. And then finally, the use of the periscope, something that I thought we would never see again in modern warfare, but still apparently is being used by at least some of the parties in conflict. Now, there are other similar striking similarities. For instance, the casualties, both in the First World War and on the Western Front, I must say, and in Ukraine, 2 out of 3 casualties are reportedly caused by artillery fire, 2 out of 3. Moreover, obviously, since late 22, front lines have remained largely static, reminiscent of the Western Front during the First World War of late 14 and early 18. And obviously, in the meantime, we have seen that in both conflicts, they involve sustained artillery bombardments, trenches and deep dugouts in order to avoid being killed by the enemy shelling, heavy casualties with minimal territorial gains, resulting in a war of attrition where Russian and Ukrainian armed forces struggle and fail to break through the enemy's position. Exactly the same issue faced by French, British and German forces and their allies on the Western Front in the First World War. So, in a nutshell, it's basically my background as a historian, combined with the resurgence of trench warfare and static front lines in Ukraine, where you need magnifying glasses to see the difference in the front lines between the upper map and the lower map. And eventually the theme of this conference that led me as a historian, and that I want to stress more than a military practitioner, to reflect on our modern doctrinal concepts, such as maneuver warfare. And allow me to please share my conclusion up front. I cannot and will not try to determine whether maneuver warfare is obsolete or dead. However, I am convinced that positional warfare is far from obsolete. And I think it may be, or it is, more relevant today than we would like to admit. This is evident, for example, in the fact that even Belgian infantry units have suddenly resumed training for trench clearing operations, and I know many other countries are doing the same. So, when I started preparing my article, my initial idea was what's supposed to be the easy part, namely I wanted to briefly explore a concept that I thought I knew, maneuver warfare. And then as a main effort, I wanted to see how positional warfare fits in or does not fit in that concept of maneuver warfare or maneuverist approach. So I conducted an extensive reading on maneuver warfare, but strangely enough, the more I read, the more confused I became. I developed an uncomfortable feeling of frustration that I did not fully grasp what maneuver warfare truly is and what it is not. And to illustrate this confusion, I have attempted to summarize all characteristics of maneuver warfare and the maneuverist approach that I found in the literature. And you can see them here listed on one slide. And I'm pretty sure that this overview is not even exhaustive. Now, I don't really need to come back to the historical origins, of maneuver warfare. It was well explained this morning. It was developed in the final decade of the Cold War as a way to counter the Warsaw Pact numerical superiority. It was a way to outthink, outmaneuver first the Soviets and now our other potential enemies. It is an attractive concept because it appeals to the strategic need for speed, agility, but also to, I think, our Western mindset, such as individual initiative and technological superiority. Now, the goal of maneuver warfare was already quoted this morning by somebody, and I quote Jordan, but this is actually the Marine Corps doctrine of 1989, saying the goal is to shatter the enemy's cohesion through a variety of rapid, focused, and unexpected actions, which create a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. However, the concept of maneuver warfare quickly became a buzzword, I think, and according to Amos Fox, even a bias. But I believe that my Belgian colleague Jeroen will elaborate more on that in his presentation in something like an hour. Now, the first point that I would like to make is that I strongly believe that maneuver warfare alone will not be sufficient to fight our future wars. It's not only the current war in Ukraine, but also other wars such as the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s, the Korean War in the early 50s, remind us that maneuver warfare is often impossible or at the very least extremely difficult to implement. And this raises the question, are we placing too much faith in that concept in maneuver warfare? And I think the answer is yes. It relies on rapid, decisive actions that dislocate the enemy, a key word we've heard already several times this morning, creating confusion and hindering effective resistance. However, as the stagnation in Ukraine demonstrates, maneuver warfare encounters significant limitations when facing well-prepared defenses, urban environments, or adversaries, such as the Russians and even the Ukrainians, obviously, who are unwilling to capitulate as easily as Iraqi soldiers did in 1991 and 2003. This is why many scholars with whom I concur have expressed doubts about the viability of relying solely on the concept of maneuver warfare in future operations. They highlight, among other things, a resurgence of defense dominance in military engagements. That's what the general already said this morning. Anticipate an increase in urban warfare, which is generally more attritional and more positional than fighting in open terrain. And they rightly assert that our potential future adversaries, whether it's China or especially Russia, will not easily collapse. And that last point, I would like to take it a little step further. Russia could, I think, potentially undermine the will and cohesion of the West, including NATO and the European Union, even without engaging in a direct conflict with us, or in the case of a direct conflict, by drawing us into a protracted war of attrition. So our Western armies simply are not equipped to sustain such a conflict, given our depleted stockpiles. Additionally, our societies are not prepared to endure significant casualties during an extended period of trench warfare, for instance. So essentially, Russia could adopt the Western model of maneuver warfare by involving us in positional warfare to wear us down, to break our will and cohesion. Moreover, the most recent attempt at employing maneuver warfare at a strategic level, for me, as for you, 82% says yes, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. So my question to QA, question 1, would have been yes. The operation aimed to overwhelm the Ukrainian armed forces through multi-axis advance, deep strikes, an advance towards the capital, which is always a high-value target, let's say, Kiev, using airborne forces, and the failed attempt to seize and hold hostile airports. I think the Russian attack met many of the characteristics that I've projected, the characteristics of maneuver warfare, such as surprise, simultaneity, agility, proficient, well, at least professional units, and mobility. To be fair, the Russians had been more successful in earlier instances such as Georgia 2008 and the Crimea 2014, where they managed to achieve their objective through campaigns that I think could be considered maneuver warfare, depending a bit on the definition you choose. The question 2 about Kharkiv in September 22, whether that qualifies as an example of maneuver warfare, it's a much tougher question. But actually, regardless the answer, I think it's important you understand that Kharkiv was only possible after 6 months of heavy attritional fighting. So attrition created conditions that allowed maneuver. And then, well, actually the attrition of 22, I think it still is a huge missed opportunity for the West to change the campaign in Ukraine, definitely, but we were too late. But it brought the Russian armed forces in September 22 to the brink of collapse, even ultimately forcing them into their first and only official wave of partial mobilization. And then the third question about the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk. To me, it doesn't really exemplify maneuver warfare. It rather represents an unequal fight with a substantial number of Ukrainian forces capturing a mere 1,000 square kilometers against a very small detachment or contingent of poorly trained Russian units, even Russian conscripts, and they are not trained at all. So even if one were to argue that this is an instance of maneuver warfare, well, I believe it ultimately signifies a failure, as Russia's will and cohesion have not been significantly degraded by this single operation. I think Kursk could have been a part of a maneuver campaign, but then I would have expected other Kursk to follow, and that, I think, could have overwhelmed and created chaos within the Russian military too. But it did not. So my answer, honestly, to Q3, even though you were right, majority is always right, as they say, I would have chosen no. But we can debate on that during a coffee break. So if maneuver warfare in itself is not sufficient to fight wars of the future, what else do we need then to be ready for the next war? Well, let me first of all be clear. Positional warfare, when used as an isolated and singular approach to a campaign, it's not the right solution either. And the same goes for attritional warfare. And I think the general already said that this morning, spoiler alert. Really, he spoiled a lot of my points, but that's good, that's good. If a lieutenant general confirms what you think, it means perhaps you're not totally wrong. So we have two well-known cases of attritional campaigns in the 20th century. The general already mentioned the US and Vietnam, but closer to where I live, we also have a famous case, the German attempt to bleed the French nation dry during First World War, 1916, Verdun, the salient around Verdun. In both cases, military commanders reported exaggerated estimates of enemy losses while presenting their own losses in an overly optimistic manner, thus creating the impression of attrition, at least on paper. And I think the same is to a certain extent going on in Ukraine, I'm afraid. Ironically, the German campaign at Verdun can also be seen as an example of the maneuverist approach. It was a German attempt, it failed, but it was a German attempt to break the French political will by inflicting overwhelming and unacceptable military losses, which in a sense amounts to maneuver warfare, or the maneuverist approach perhaps, but through attrition. So I think we have to be ready to do positional warfare, although it's often dismissed as outdated, inefficient. It involves digging in, true, holding ground, which is passive, as Clausewitz would say. I just want to mention Clausewitz. I'm not such a fan of Clausewitz, but every senior officer who speaks to an audience should use Clausewitz from time to time, so I did. Check in the box. But it's not flashy, it's not glorious, it doesn't look good on a PowerPoint slide, but the fact is, historically, positional and attritional warfare have been the default, especially when maneuver fails. And maneuver fails perhaps more often than we would like to recognize. Closely related to positional warfare is then the concept of attrition, another word that makes most military strategists cringe. Attrition means wearing down the enemy, accepting that losses may be high and that progress may be slow. In a Western world of instant gratification, attrition is like waiting for a slow internet connection. It's painful, but sometimes it's the only way forward. Throughout history, wars have often been decided through attrition, whether we like that or not. And the First World War, significant parts of the Second World War is associated with Blitzkrieg, but in the end it was decided by attrition, not by May 40 or whatever happened. The Korean War after 51 became positional and attritional. It was stopped because Stalin died in 53, so it created an opportunity to stop the war. But if not, it would have continued, it would have become an attritional war. The Iran-Iraq War started with good intention on both sides to do maneuver, perhaps not called maneuver, but mobile warfare, but ended up in positional warfare. And the current war in Ukraine equally demonstrates that you can start with the best intentions of mobile, of maneuver warfare, but if it doesn't work out, you have to go back to attritional and positional warfare. So, as a conclusion, the idea that our doctrinal preference for maneuver warfare makes positional and attritional warfare unnecessary, I think it's misguided and even harmful for the quality of our military tools. In the future, military commanders must be flexible enough to switch between maneuver, positional and attritional warfare, depending on the circumstances. I want to be clear, I don't think we have to bury maneuver warfare. That's not the point I'm making. But it's about recognizing its limits and preparing to adapt when the enemy refuses to play along. So I would say maneuver warfare plan A and positional warfare as a plan B. I can live with that. For instance, the best approach in future campaigns may be to maneuver to isolate enemy forces or encircle strategic objectives, followed by a period of positional tactics to hold that ground. And I think flexibility, and I think the general already spoiled it this morning too, flexibility will be key. So maneuver warfare can disorient and demoralize an opponent, but positional warfare can have a similarly devastating effect on morale too, although in a much slower way. But also, again, I think we have to reconsider what enemies can do to us, and I refer again to Russia. What if they impose a positional, attritional war on us? How will we respond to that with our maneuverist approach? Will we be able to overcome the stalemate in that case through maneuver? Question mark, open question. We need to train our officers not just for the rapid, smooth, nearly unopposed decisive moments, so those staff officers in the room would draw these large arrows on the maps, that's what I mean, but also for positional warfare, the long, slow grind. And I think a good commander should know when to press the attack with rapid movement or when to dig in and to prepare for attritional slug-in. Warfare, and I strongly believe that, is not only a science but also an art. The true artist, commander, the talented and skilled commander, well, he should know how to blend these approaches seamlessly. Thank you for your attention.